And now we're live. Ryan Ray alongside Chris Fenton. Chris, I gotta ask you this. I've been meaning to ask this for a while. Your handles are the Dragon Feeder on social media at the Dragon Feeders you have here. But your book seems to be about not feeding the dragon. So are you still feeding the dragon? And real quick, for those who aren't familiar, why do you go by that handle?
You know what? I thought the Dragon Feeder was an interesting handle because, unfortunately, I was complicit in feeding the dragon, and quite frankly, we're still feeding the dragon quite a bit. And until we stop, I think I'm going to have to keep using these labels. Otherwise, I'm a hypocrite in all this too. I think the key to this sort of idea of working out a show. And I love the fact that, Ryan, you reached out. I think your perspective on everything China comes from a different point of view than mine. And I think between the two of us, we got this great Venn diagram sort of circumference of circles that's really going to make something that's entertaining, hopefully approachable and slightly educational. So I'm excited to sort of try this out. I mean, it's December 23rd. So a lot of people are probably doing holiday things and not really paying attention to Twitter right now. So if we have an epic fail with this idea, it's a tree falling in the woods, right? So,
if you are watching along, we will take questions. So be sure to hit us up. We have the comments open. So happy to take those, if you will. And so let's kind of talking about a few things. Don't know how long we're going to go today, but we'll see how it goes, as you said. See how long it takes the tree to fall, if you will. We were talking offline, and you brought up Daryl Morey, and it's been probably about a year ago, roughly, since maybe a year. I'm trying to think. That happened after I came back from China, I believe. So about a year, roughly, right? Since he sent a tweet that said, "Free Hong Kong, stand with Hong Kong," something pretty benign in the grand scheme of things that are said on Twitter, and it felt like the CCP, the NBA, and everyone lost their mind. Of course, he was the GM of the Houston Rockets. The Rockets underperformed this year. He was moved on. Some have speculated that he might have been let go regardless because of the China kerfuffle. Now he's with the 76ers. I'll be quite honest with you, Chris. I was surprised that he got another job so quickly. I thought maybe go sit on the sideline a year or two. What was your take on him getting a job?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And the idea behind this show, Shall It Work, and shall we get good feedback from our followers, is the fact that if we call it Feeding the Dragon or whatever we end up calling it, we want to cover the news events that are happening every single day that we're out there tweeting about or talking about on social media, where we only get so many sentences or so many words to talk about. And I think, as we've seen from followers, they want to discuss this more. And a lot of times they don't agree with what we say, or a lot of times they do. Whatever it is, this is, I guess, what you want to call a safe space. We'll take any criticism and we'll take any compliments, whatever you want, because this is about making China not a third rail issue, which is what it's been for a long, long time. So what, Ryan, you're talking about earlier is this ESPN report that came out today about how Daryl Morey, the GM of the Houston Rockets, who, if you recall, back in October of last year, October 2019, tweeted his support for the Hong Kong protesters. And he did that from Houston, Texas, which, by the way, is part of the United States of America, which also has freedom of speech rights that are firmly protected by the Constitution of the United States. Well, he tweeted that out. And the moment I saw that, when I was at a soccer game with my kids, I looked at it. I saw a guy I'd never heard of before, but he happened to be the GM of the Houston Rockets. And I thought, oh, my God, that tweet is going to get him in trouble. Hong Kong is a seriously sensitive topic right now. And over the next couple of days, of course, the NBA, Houston Rockets, and Daryl Morey all got in a lot of trouble.
The athlete moving better, then
Chris,
this is something that may hopefully decrease.
Hold on. Sorry, I was trying to pull up a link to the article and send it to people, and it started autoplaying. I apologize. Go ahead.
I love it. We're going to need this thing works. We're going to hire a team of producers, and everybody's going to be in there helping us out. So we can just blabber. But anyway, the point of the story is that Houston the GM of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, and the NBA all got retaliated against by the CCP. And as we know from the reports, they lost their ability to air the NBA games in China for a full year. And all the partners ran away from them. Lots of money was essentially lost in that one single tweet. And what was really concerning was the fact that the NBA and others did not stand behind Daryl Morey's right to free speech. And the fact that in Houston, Texas, you should have the ability to criticize the Chinese government for something you don't agree in. What's interesting is that over the past year, there's been a lot of speculation that Daryl Morey would, in fact, lose his job, not only at the Houston Rockets, but probably be pushed out of the NBA forever because of the amount of damage financially he had happened to the NBA because of that single tweet. But lo and behold, shortly after he left the Houston Rockets or resigned, he got hired by the Philadelphia 76ers. And even he was surprised, according to this ESPN article today that we tweeted out, that he was rehirable in the NBA. My point that I'm worried about is that I do think the CCP and China will retaliate for that hire. I think that was probably something that the 76ers wanted to do and the NBA supported because they have every right to do it. But I don't think China weighed in, so we'll see what happens. But the bottom line is, I love what Daryl Morey did back when he tweeted his support for Hong Kong, because that is a free speech right. Number two is I love the fact that NBA rehired him because he's a heck of a GM. And three, for how critical I've been of ESPN and Disney over the past year about the lack of coverage on this subject, I also commend them on covering it today in ESPN magazine and on their actual website, because there is a lot of risk in that. That could have retaliation against them from the CCP just simply for reporting on what they reported on today. So we'll see how this plays out. But right now, I'm a little hopeful about this situation.
What makes this story weird is that, and I don't know what percentage of Americans know this, it's not like the average Chinese citizen can get on Twitter and see what Daryl Morey even said. And that's what really makes the story weird, is that when you talk about the CCP and their control, is that they really, when they want to control something, there's not necessarily logic behind what they're doing from our perspective. They want to do it, and therefore they enforce their will. And so you might look at this and say, well, okay, to your point, maybe they contact Yao Ming and some of his contacts and ask permission. Maybe they didn't. You don't know. They could change their mind tomorrow. This is something that the CCP could bring up in 3 or 4 months. And it's really hard from the NBA standpoint, because you're kind of walking on eggshells and going, okay, well, how do you placate what they want? And I mean, listen, it's a huge, as you know, a huge market. NBA players fly over there all the time off season to do signings and appearances and TV commercials and stuff like that. And so it's a huge market. And so I'm sympathetic to the business standpoint of it. But if they're not careful, they will get to where they can't say anything. And then, that won't play well with America, because in our own country, we've had a lot of social issues that have come up that NBA has been very outspoken over. And so, and been a lot more on point than what Daryl Morey said. And so I think they had to be careful trying to placate. And I'm curious to think, let's see here. So the NBA they start Christmas Day, right? So
no, they just started last night. There was a Clippers-Lakers game on last night.
So last night was the first night. Do you think we'll get to a point this, by Christmas, New Year's, with all this going on in the world, the CCP will bring this up? They brought up a lot of things internationally during the last 6 to 8 months have been weird. India, Australia. I mean, they're tackling anything. Will they come back to the NBA, you think?
It's going to be really interesting. I'm going to check in over the holidays just to see what's airing in regards to the NBA coverage. Remember, they were taking off CCTV 5, which is the equivalent of ESPN here in the United States for China, except it's broadcast throughout the country. I believe over 1 billion people get that feed. So that's a huge market for them, and huge consumer awareness and the ability to watch those games. Once it was pulled off of there, it moved into streaming in certain aspects. But it was very rare that you could actually pull in those feeds or the streams, at least in the early days of that retaliation. So we're going to have to see how this works. Now, one of the things that I've been very vocal about in regards to the way, for instance, Disney handled Mulan, or Disney, ESPN, NBA, and all their partners handled this Daryl Morey tweet, is exactly what you said. I mean, number one is the CCP has the ability to firewall those types of criticism from their populace first seeing. So just the fact that they're retaliating for things that they don't agree with in regards to criticism we're doing on our soil about what we don't agree with China is ridiculous, because they're able to firewall. They're able to essentially silence that criticism and make sure it's completely censored in their market. Where they're pushing it is over across their borders and saying, no, we want that censored from the world. And that's a real issue. And it creates these geopolitical crises or controversies that create all kinds of crazy problems for the CCP in regards to trying to continue to silence it. Like, as it starts to boil over, it starts to seep into their country and people start to pick it up, whether it's around the firewall or whether they're saying it on Weibo, which is the Chinese form of Twitter, or whatever else. So they're taking these tempests in a teapots and allowing them to crescendo into these massive boulders running down the hill, gathering all this moss, right? If they just allowed us the ability to criticize them on our soil, right? I'm not even asking to be able to do it in Beijing. I mean, here in Houston, Texas, right? They can keep these things contained and they won't become face-losing criticism, geopolitical situations that spiral out of control. So it's something that I think is actually in the best interest of the CCP to back off on and allow us the rights that we deserve here in this country, because we fought for them over the last 200 years.
And just a quick history note: we saved them during World War II to preserve them. So just a quick reminder of history. Yeah, those are precious. We do have a comment here. Chris is making great points. It's a little early to be patting Chris on the back. Let's save his compliments for later on.
Yeah, and by the way, if any of us make bad points, I want to hear that too. Because remember,
don't worry, that guy. I know that guy. He'll be on me when I start talking here in a second.
Well, China is really complicated, and the interaction with this country is over the top complicated. So it's all we're trying to do is remove the third rail issue from this discussion and talk about it. And that's something all Americans need to do. So, it's important that we hear feedback, and, because now we're becoming sort of voices in this thing, which is a little crazy to me. I sort of think of myself as a layman that fell into the whole China thing. Right. But, people are listening to what we have to say. I'm on television a lot talking about it. And I like to use the feedback from all kinds of people to try to figure out, how do we structure these arguments and how do we structure potential solutions?
Well, and so let's pause on the NBA, because some people might say, listen, that's the NBA, it's a private business. But your point is true, because you talked about this, and I interviewed Eric Bagshaw from Australia the other day, and he was talking about the demands from China for their barley and their coal, and they got really upset over all these issues and really insignificant stuff. But one of the things that China was pressing the Australian government is you cannot criticize the CCP, Xi Jinping, the leadership. You can't do that. That's just not allowed. And because the Australians would not allow for that to happen, they pulled their, two of the biggest exports from Australia and that China was bringing in, and bought it to Brazil and the U.S. and these other spots. Well, that's a lot of pressure on the Australian economy, right? And so the Daryl Morey tweet might seem silly or irrelevant or not a big deal, but there are legitimate conversations. And I'm actually going through a book. I don't know if you've read this or not, Chris. It's called The Dragon's Gift. And it's one of the things that I think it's a lady who wrote it. It's a lady who reads it. So I think of a lady author. But anyways, she talks about in Africa, all of the countries in Africa that get aid, they all cannot recognize Taiwan as an independent country. That's the deal. If you recognize Taiwan, you are excluded. And so the Daryl Morey is just a microcosm of the larger points and how the CCP puts pressure. And the best way to fight back, in my opinion, is to do the opposite of what they want you to do. Because once you normalize it and you say, well, Taiwan's a country, free Hong Kong, whatever, then it would be so weird for someone to say, you can't do that. It's like, yeah, does this.
No, it's great. It's great. And by the way, you had a great guest, Eric from the Herald, the Sydney Herald, the other day, who brought up something that I've been talking about quite a bit, which is we do have a ticking clock here. I mean, if we continue to allow the Chinese Communist Party to continue encroaching on the rights that we have here in the United States, continue to encroach on trade issues where imbalances of unfair, revenue splits, of forced JVs, of forced tech transfers, of essentially all kinds of things that, quite frankly, if you go back into the early parts of our own industrial revolution, we were doing to Europe just to get caught up to speed with them. But, one thing that Europe did that we seem to be reluctant to do right now is they came out and said, hey, United States, enough is enough. You caught up to us now. In fact, you caught up to us taking, intellectual property to help develop the cotton gin or whatever else it was and created all these protectionist policies. Now that you're caught up to speed with us, we're going to level the playing field. And I'm not sure why we haven't tried that today. But as your guest the other day was talking about, Australia's taking this stand because they feel like if we don't take this stand now, we'll forever be essentially subject to the fact that China is going to institute their will on our policies, our values, our principles as a nation. And I look at the way Australia is starting to stand up to them going, wait, we needed to do the same thing. And quite frankly, we should be doing it with Australia and with our other Western allies in order to get the job done and push back that Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. So I'm curious your thoughts, because for me, one of the things that I kind of cover a lot is this free speech idea. And in the West, we have a lot of debates over hate speech and this, that, and the other. And it's like, guys, you're missing the boat. Once you start getting the government in the business of what is good speech, what is bad speech, you can see to China where it goes. How effective do you think it is for us just to say things like free Hong Kong, or, we support the Hong Kong protesters, or, if you get to the Hong Kong protesters, obviously, they go to lampooning Xi Jinping with the Winnie the Pooh faces and stuff like that. So they can get really, really kind of, for their standards, pretty visceral. For the U.S., to call Trump orange man bad is not a big deal. So where do you think our line as Americans or the global community should be to normalize speech, to move the Overton window so that when we say stuff, it's just a given and it's not really controversial, so that it's hard for the CCP to push back against that?
Well, I would say number one is, if it was that important to America, we'd probably make it one of the first amendments. Oh, wait, it is the First Amendment. So it is super important to us, right? And there's nothing more irritating to people on the right or the left than if they're silenced by the media and they can't speak up against, people that are Republican, if they're Democrat, or Republicans against Democrats, or libertarians if they're neither. I mean, those are soapbox opportunities that the United States has protected through various wars and all kinds of different debates in Congress. So it's something that's super important and super inherent to being American. So I think it's really important for us to be able to criticize things out loud. And it actually provides a necessary pressure release for a lot of things that may be harder obstacles to overcome. For instance, if you look at Disney during the Mulan controversy, if people don't know this, they had this big movie Mulan, which took place it was a movie about China and this protagonist who's a female, and it's female empowerment, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also a lot of sort of CCP narrative throughout it. But one of the things that Disney did, and I know it was a complete oversight because I've seen it before in movies, is they did thank the Xinjiang government and various other entities that were involved in the Xinjiang atrocities to Uyghurs. That's a perfect situation where free speech would have stopped a tempest in a teapot from turning into this massive boulder gathering moss down the hill that created face loss on both sides, right?
So let's kind of unpack that. So just for folks who don't get lost in the weeds here. So we have the new Mulan movie, right? And in the post credits, there's a reference from Disney thanking someone in China. So unpack exactly who that is and why that's controversial, just so we can follow along here.
Yeah. So for everybody at home that's watching, if it's 1 or 2 or 2 million, here's the situation. So you have Mulan, big tentpole movie, $200 million. It was an idea that Disney wanted to bring to life in a big U.S. studio kind of way, a legend about a hero that's had a lot of mythology around it over many years, and various other sort of Chinese language movies and television series derived from it. They made the movie. Part of the movie was shot in Xinjiang province, which is where the ethnic minority of the Uyghurs is being persecuted for their beliefs in the Muslim religion. And some of that persecution is in the form of imprisonment, forced labor, torture, various other things. We're not exactly sure what's happening over there, but there's millions that are victims to it. When they brought in the cameras and they shot some of that movie, Disney had to obviously get a lot of different approvals from various levels of government in China. Government dictates everything that you have access to over there, and it starts with the central government and goes all the way down to local government. Typically in a movie, when you have access to things, whether it's here in the United States or in another country or even in China, you thank some of those authorities, some of those entities that granted you that access. If you see a movie like Marvel shoots a lot of movies in Georgia and the Atlanta area, if you go through the 8 minutes of credits, you'll probably see various Georgia authorities, film commissions, various other people thanked in that. That's what Disney did in the case of Mulan, except some of those entities happen to also be involved in what's happening to the Uyghur population over there. And journalists came across that and essentially reported on it. And it became a big controversy here in the United States. Now, if we go back to the freedom of speech right that we've been talking about earlier, I think what would have kept that controversy contained would have been the ability for Disney to say, whoa, that was a terrible oversight, and we apologize for it. That should have never happened. And then on top of it, they should have made an announcement saying, and we 100% do not condone what's happening to minority populations in that province of China. That is not something we stand for as a company. If they did that, that could have been contained from getting into into China and into the populace's ability to know that that apology and that criticism was made. Why? Because they have a firewall in China. What would have happened here is that Disney would have deflated pressure that was coming from journalists, coming from Congress, right? There were bipartisan letters to the CEO of Disney. There was also Senator Josh Hawley, who was also sending his own letters to Bob Chapek at Disney. It would have diffused a serious, stressful situation on that company and allowed the criticism to abate. But instead, China is known to retaliate for that type of freedom of speech, and Disney put its head in the sand and didn't say anything, and the controversy spiraled out of control into both sides of the Pacific. A tempest in a teapot that could have been contained just simply by the right to free speech.
Well, let me ask you this. So I live in Texas. I'm sitting in Texas right now. Were these thank you in the credits, these acknowledgments in the credits, would it be like thanking Greg Abbott? So you could say at any time something in Texas bad is happening, right? Depending on your view of life, something in Texas that you don't agree with is happening. So if you think Greg Abbott, you could theoretically blame him for this. Or is it more akin to saying, no, they were thanking the police guard who is just responsible for his subordinate beating someone up publicly? Like, how far removed were these government officials? Because, that also has to be weighed in, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you get into the weeds of who they thanked, I'm pretty certain, and obviously I haven't researched it, but I'm pretty certain the security guard that protected the movie shoot while they were filming something wasn't the same security guard who beat to death a couple Uyghurs. Like, right. I don't think the micro of that got to that point. I think ultimately what it might have been is simply the state of Georgia, the city of Atlanta, the police department of, the municipal area, protecting our location shoot, right, granting us access, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, what's interesting is that same police division also has various individuals involved with those atrocities. Right. And that's where the correlation probably was. That's me speculating, but that's my guess.
That's my understanding as well. Happy to be proven wrong on that. But that's my understanding as well, which leads me to this point. part of the thing that I think it's responsible for the American side to do is to balance out how to think about China. There are 100 million members of the CCP. So when me and you were talking CCP, we're talking top level leadership, the ones who are really moving the needle, but we're not talking about someone who's working at a regional facility and he's just a CCP member and he's going in there doing his thing. And so, to your point, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying about, could they have rewritten their statement or whatever, but also Americans have to understand how to think in categories that work globally. If you think Greg Abbott for something, you're not saying that everything the state of Texas does is good or bad, or Newsom or Trump or whatever. We've got this kind of binary position where it's either all good or it's all bad. In this case, I don't know all the specifics, so it could be directly thinking someone who killed someone. So I'm happy to.
No, I think I'm 100% with you, but the symbolism of it was bad in a lot of ways, because also if we backtrack even a year prior to that, Mulan was also controversial as a movie because the lead actress came out in support of the crackdown by the PLA on Hong Kong protesters. And that was an extremely vocal criticism that Disney once again kept its head in the sand about, even though journalists, the American public, various members of Congress wanted them to say something about. So it's to me, I don't think Disney, well, first of all, they didn't consciously and purposely thank organizations that they knew were involved with that stuff. That was an oversight probably by people way down the food chain that never even thought about it, right? So that's one issue. But number two is, once they did get caught, once it was public, and once that oversight was found out, it was a very simple apology that Disney could have done from a company corporate level, and then a simple statement about how they disagree with what's happening to ethnic minorities in that region of China. It would have been that simple. I don't think anybody's asking Disney to go cure the problem.
Right.
What Disney is a bastion of freedom of speech and creative expression, right? For arts and for filmmakers and everything else. So for them to stay crickets and silence, that's what really ticked off people.
Well, so what I'm saying is that from Disney's standpoint, they should be able to come out and nuance it. Say, listen, we think these people, there are good and bad people everywhere, just like in Georgia, and be able to say that, listen, we have to, one thing we don't want to do is to frame this debate where everyone in China is bad. And that's part of the narrative that I push back on. You can't say everyone in China is bad. That's just not the case. Most of them are just like us. They're just average people doing average things, and they're not involved with.
You and I both have friends that are Chinese. Like, there's no, it's ridiculous. It's like saying all Democrats are terrible, or all Republicans are terrible, or all, blacks are terrible, or all whites are terrible. Whatever it is, right? That's just a terrible generalization.
I agree. So the fact that Disney can't do that, can't nuance that position, that to me is the more troubling thing, that they're not willing to come out and say, hey, listen, we thank these people because we shot a movie there. And that's, what do you do to your host? You thank your host. Now, are we endorsing all of the crazy stuff over here? No. But when someone has you to your house, you say thank you. That's what you do. And so those are simple statements and things that Americans and the world has to get back together. And it's frustrating for Disney. Now, this is to your point. I don't think Disney is a bastion of free speech. They're a private business. And I think that we as consumers have to decide if we want to align with a business that can't make a simple, nuanced message because they're afraid to lose money. I'm not blaming Disney for not losing money. It's a tough decision. It's a big market.
I'll go one more step though. It's a really good point, but I think there's a couple kinds of free speech, right? There's a free speech right where non-government will retaliate against you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, Chick-fil-A, right?
Yeah.
They haven't been open, I believe, to gay marriage, and there's issues there, right? And the homosexual population of the United States of America, because people are free and have those rights, are able to boycott going to Chick-fil-A because they don't agree with the stance of the company or the corporate. And that is a consumer right to boycott for somebody exercising their free speech rights. This is different. This is a government that's allowing free speech rights to be retaliated against, right? By the government, not by the consumer. So I would say, hey, if China or if Disney came out, exercised its free speech rights, and says, We're sorry. That was a terrible oversight. It will never happen again. And we don't condone what's happening to the ethnic minorities in China and especially in the Xinjiang province. They say that the government doesn't retaliate. They let Disney do what they do in that market. But consumers come across those statements, and consumers in China go, well, wait a minute. We're actually re-educating those people. We're actually doing them a service. You're wrong, and you're criticizing us for something we don't believe in. We're not going to go to Disney movies. We're not going to go to the Disney theme park. We're not going to buy Disney products. That's a completely different issue, and it's a complete right that the Chinese would have, just as much as we would have the right to say what we want to say critically. So that's where the issue is. Like, I have no problem. Well, there's bigger issues, right? But like on the micro issue that we're saying we could accomplish today, the idea of getting back free speech rights to criticize things we don't agree with another country is something I think we could get back today if we push back on the CCP, right? The bigger issue is, as a country, do we want Disney doing business in China because they're doing these things we criticize and they haven't changed? That's an even bigger North Star issue that we need to get to someday and address, but we can't even get there if we can't do these baby steps.
Right. So someone said Ryan thinks businesses should be compelled to espouse moral views. No, that's not what I said, or I didn't mean to say it if that's what I said. I think my point is that China, Disney filmed a movie in China. People say, hey, why did you do this thing? Thank these people, whatever. Disney is within their rights to say nothing. I firmly believe that. It's within my rights to say, if you can't come out and make this simple statement, I'm not going to buy your product. Those are all our rights. I'm saying the fact that Disney can't make a simple nuanced statement here is kind of silly. But listen, they have stockholders, shareholders to report to, and guess who those people are? People like me and you. And so the free speech argument and the ability to make market-based decisions, we want to be able to make those in all of these scenarios. So we want to use the market to say, hey, listen, Disney, we want you to stand up for free speech. You made a typo, you made a slight error. We get it. Just nuance it out. Oh, you won't? Well, then we don't want to buy our movies from you anymore. That I'm fine with both sides of that. Disney is the company. They can do what they want, but that doesn't make them free of responsibility to their shareholders and to their investors and all stuff.
Well, so I would just add to that what we need to do is protect these companies, right? Like if Senator Hawley and a bipartisan makeup of Congress is upset at Bob Chapek for not saying something on behalf of this controversy, then the United States government has to also back them and say, hey, if you do what we're asking you to do and you're retaliated against, China's going to have to deal with the country at large. And how do you do that? Well, I go back to the domestic issue that the NBA boycotted those series of games for, right? It was police violence, BLM issues, all that kind of stuff. And what was interesting is that when they boycotted, everybody else in the sports industry boycotted with them. Okay, that's a domestic issue. It's a little apples and oranges. But what I would say in terms of Disney is if Disney comes out and does what everybody wants them to do, and there's retaliation against them for that, then the whole industry at large, the entertainment industry, that means all the studios, all the partners from the IMAXs and the Hasbros and Mattels and everything else, to the United States government has to say, hey, Disney exercised the right to free speech while here in the United States of America. They did something we're proud of, something that's valued and a principle of America, and we're going to back them. So until you repair this retaliation, you're not going to get any of the goods and services from that industry. And you're also going to have the weight of the country lean on you until you right this.
So let me ask you this question. So think of a couple of examples here. Dixie Chicks, Freedom Fries. There's probably some more groups that have gone, when France came out and went back into the war in Iraq or everything about that. Dixie Chicks was critical. If you take a pro-American stance, it really doesn't matter much else. If you just say, you know what, screw you guys, we're planting our flag right here in America, the American public generally will rally around you. And so you don't, I'm not much on legislative backing, but I will say for Disney's standpoint, I don't know, this is why I went to the financial side, because they would get a lot of support in the U.S. if they came out and said, listen, we don't care about Chinese money. We want the U.S. dollar. even if that's not true, they would get a huge rallying of support from Americans buying Disney Plus, Mickey Mouse dolls, whatever. My question is there enough meat on the American bone to sustain them based upon how their model has worked with overseas revenue, especially from China?
Yeah, I think, well, there's a couple of things. One is, and the reason why we're talking about maybe doing this show on a regular basis is to try to get as many people in the United States of America and our Western allies thinking about China in ways that they haven't thought about before. And if you look at Disney maybe standing up and saying something in the case of Mulan, I question whether enough people in the United States are cognizant enough of the problem. I mean, there's a very vocal minority that was saying, you need to do this, Disney, this is wrong. But is it a majority which translates into real consumer excitement for standing up for what's right? I don't know, because I know on the China side that it doesn't need a consumer majority. It doesn't even need a consumer minority to shut them out of that market. All it needs is a handful of people inside the Chinese Communist Party to shut them out. So to weigh the loss of that market with the gain in the United States is probably a very difficult formula to evaluate. So I think in the meantime, until people are fully up to speed on China and sort of the threat that the CCP poses on us, you do need some government help, or at least people that can rally a whole industry, sort of like LeBron James for the NBA or Phil Knight for Nike. Who's that person? Who are those people in the entertainment business that can rally a unified front against that kind of retaliation? That's going to be important because, if it's just one company or one person, it's always going to be a sacrificial lamb whack-a-mole situation. And you look at Disney, if they came out and said something and no one backed them, you could find that maybe their Shanghai theme park gets stripped of them, which they only own 43% of anyway. As we saw with their Hong Kong park, the CCP just went in there and took away their expansion rights around that park during the middle of that controversy. You could see their movies not get into the market, a lot of other stuff. And then other companies like Universal, for instance, which is building a theme park up in Beijing, maybe the CCP just goes to Universal, hey, by the way, we're kicking Disney out. Why don't you take over their theme park? Right? It just gets replaced by somebody else.
Here's where I struggle on this, because the big companies have made billions of dollars in China, and they've made them by owning 43% of this park or doing these deals. And so now that the CCP is tightening the reins, if you will, they're getting squeezed a little bit. It's hard for me to say, well, I should back them, because I'm not entirely convinced that they're actually going to stand by the principles that they espouse to me. So, backing Disney or getting a bunch of U.S. companies to come together would be great. But are you convinced that the market in the U.S. is going to be big enough to keep those people here, or as soon as they can, they'll strike a new deal with China? Because this with China censoring movies and stuff, it's not new. They've been censoring movies in China for quite some time now. As you say, most people don't know that. So this is not a new problem that Disney's facing. It's just a little bit of criticism that they're getting that's being exposed. So it's kind of hard to say, well, I feel bad for Disney on one hand, because they knew this going into the deal with China a long time ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, the censoring of movies is a little different too, because censoring of movies occurs with a lot of different markets. I mean, we have censor movies for South Korea and Japan and for the Middle Eastern markets. So censoring for particular markets, one thing, but if we're moving cross-border censorship, which is where I have a real problem, where the Chinese Communist Party is saying, hey, Tom Cruise in that latest Top Gun movie, you got to remove the Taiwanese and Japanese flag from the back of your flight jacket so the whole world doesn't see either of those flags. That's a real problem. To whitewash them for the Chinese market, well, you could argue that's fine. I mean, I get that there's a lot of people are going to say, oh, censoring anything is terrible, but we do it in other markets is something we live with. But when the Chinese Communist Party is saying, no, we don't want somebody in Argentina to see those flags, we don't want somebody in Canada seeing those flags, somebody in Illinois seeing those flags, like that's a real problem.
So, yeah, no. I think we're on the same page here, but I want to tease it out one more step. If you do business with the mob, okay, and the mob says, hey, we want 10% of your revenue and we're going to protect you, it's kind of hard for me to be sympathetic that next week they come back and want 15% plus interest. And so that's kind of the hard part for me, is that if you go back to look at how these companies went into China, they did deals that they knew at the time weren't lucrative. Obviously, China didn't have the power that it does now, and so it's kind of that's you see the tension there. It's like, well, you did do business with shady people, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm fine with them censoring their movies, but I'm also hard. It's hard to get the sympathy up too much for them as well. And I think that's part of why it doesn't resonate here in the States, is because people know that they've been doing some of this stuff. They've been making all this money, and now they're wanting us to support them when they got themselves into this bid. We didn't make them go to China. We didn't make them do. You see what I'm saying? Like, how would you argue against that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, unfortunately, the world's filled with a lot of those type of people that you're doing business with. I mean, you know it well from the oil and gas industry and our interaction with Saudi Arabia and a lot of those Middle Eastern countries. And quite frankly, that's a tough one to take a stand against, because every American is touched by petroleum products. So, China, unfortunately, through 40 years of a really rampant globalist capitalistic mission, that I was a part of as a cog in the wheel, open that market to your products and services any way possible. And we got really good at it. And eventually these companies started to get so accustomed to the revenues and the profit growth that China presented that their whole stock relies on it. If you watch the average company that's traded on the Dow or the S&P or the NASDAQ, when they make an announcement that just uses the word China and something in a positive manner of what they're doing in China, it pops the stock every time, because the market is just so big. So we really got ourselves in a bit of a jam as a country, but we're a great country, and we're a country that's very innovative and knows how to battle back and push back against things we don't agree with. I'm just wondering why we haven't at this point. I mean, is rampant capitalism and globalism so much more important than some form of patriotism? I sometimes question whether that's the case right now, because there is no capitalism. There's no form of globalism if we're not protecting what makes this country and the foundation of that capitalism great. So we need to remember that if that's on shaky ground, then the capitalism becomes on shaky ground.
Okay. We've been going about 40 minutes here. I got one more thing for you, then we'll either wrap up or unless you have something else. So, as we work these issues, we think of these issues. Yes, you have to do business with bad people. I agree with all that, just to be clear. I think the messaging is the hard thing to sell to the American people, because they're looking at this going, I haven't made all this money in China. You did. Now you want me to back you because you're doing business with the mob. That's the hard sell. How, from your perspective, let's just say that the NBA, China, I kind of teased this the other day with my Australian piece was, well, if you look at China's imports, the biggest thing that they need from Australia is iron ore, and Australia is disproportionately the largest supplier of iron ore. So if Australia called up China and said, hey, screw you guys, no more iron ore, that would be a big squeeze on China. Now, it would crush the Aussies, but it would really hurt the Chinese. Does the entertainment sports media industry have that kind of stroke to where enough Chinese citizens might miss it to put pressure on the government? So if they said, you know what, we're not selling any more products to the Chinese market until you guys back off, do you think that would create enough upward pressure for Xi Jinping and CCP to have to say, okay, we got to let some of this stuff in here?
Well, it's a really good question, but it creates, I think, a leak into one of the big sort of missions of the Chinese Communist Party. And when I look at the country overall and how that leadership views things in the most macro perspective, I always talk about this idea that their biggest goal is to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. Right. So in the case of Australia, we're actually seeing, I believe it's the coal trade right now, which is creating a backlog of coal that needs to get into China. But there's this trade dispute. There's this, sort of heavy stance on both sides that's keeping that trade from occurring. And China's like, screw it. We're just going to turn off the lights in a lot of these second and third tier cities at night because we don't have enough energy source. Right. And that's pretty interesting because it shows just how powerful and how far China will push it to try to win a trade situation and resolve it on their terms. But at the same token, if they want to keep a revolution from happening, turning off lights is not a good way to make people just happy enough that they don't revolt. Right. So there's only so much they can do there. Now, I would say the same thing when it comes to entertainment or sports, right? If the NBA shut out of the market for a year, that they can tolerate that. They can deflect attention or whatever it is. But if the whole sports community gets behind it, that becomes different. If the sports community actually shuts down going to Beijing and in the next Olympics, that's a huge, not only face loss, but a pride loss, a nationalistic loss. That's something that creeps towards revolution. And the same thing with the entertainment content that we create in Hollywood. There's an aspirational quality. It creates a lot of sort of this idea of, building into a middle class, having certain freedoms that are allowed in China that they aspire to have, all that kind of stuff. And if you take that all out, it does seep into the psyche of the 1.31 billion people that aren't a part of the Chinese Communist Party. And it does start to lead towards potential unrest. So the Chinese government's always thinking about that. So my point is as a lone wolf, as a sacrificial lamb, you're not going to get anything done. And I actually think Australia is in that situation right now. If they're taking this stand by themselves, they might end up having to relent and push and retreat. But if you have a united front, we can get China to push back on a variety of different issues. We just need to have the wherewithal to do that.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because, the coal stuff and of course the iron ore is the thing that they could. So China kind of has the Aussies by the balls, if you will, on the coal, but the iron ore is where they could really do it. But it would just ruin their economy. So if you said there was a global coalition to spread out the iron ore purchasing from Australia, we're not going to give it to you what China was paying. We'll pay a discount for a long-term period. That would really, because China throws up iron. Like, I mean, they build stuff like it's going out of style. So that would be a way to really impact them. And the final thing is, just to your point, the CCP, they do hate free speech, and we have to remember that. So when I don't want, and this is where you have to be careful from my perspective, is I don't presume to know the best way to make the CCP to be more free in the sense of, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And the last thing I want to do is endorse policies that make people starve to death, right? So you have to be kind of careful. But that being said, having a disgruntled populace is the steps that the CCP does not want to happen. They are very afraid of that. That's why they marched into Hong Kong and went ahead and shut that down. It wasn't because there's people on the streets walking around. It's because they were talking. There's a lot of people in the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, is that they were talking about things that are not allowed. And that's the thing that Americans and everywhere around the world is, you have to remember the CCP, North Korea, those groups, they hate speech. And not hate speech, but they hate the idea of free speech. And the more of that is that's out there, the more powerful the people are, and we are against them. So, Chris, any final thoughts? This was great to do.
Yeah. Well, what else? That's so true. You're right on the mark there. And I think the beauty of whether we start doing this on a regular basis and people actually like these sort of live talks is that the two different perspectives we come at are so great to tackle a lot of these issues and talk about them and get people sort of, spreading the word on the China issue. I think if anybody's, was watching and wants to tweet sort of, hey, any sort of tweaks you want to have to something like this in the live show format that we have here, I think we're very open to it. The fact is, what we want to do is take some of these topical situations, things that we're out tweeting about, and bring them to life in a way that sort of shows, hey, all Americans are touched by China. It's hard to understand how that happens and why it's not in our best interest to continue on this course that we're on. But that's what we want to talk about. And we want to do it in an entertaining way. And we really want to have interaction with the people that watch this. And we really appreciate it. And perhaps we'll do this a few more times over the holidays to see if the tree falls and people hear it. But, thank you for watching us today. And Ryan, you're an awesome host, and now you're sort of a co-host. So it's interesting to see you form into a different persona on screen. So this has been pretty awesome.
Well, thanks, Chris, for accepting the invitation. It was fun. And so I always love chatting. And listeners, Chris is at the Dragon Feeder is where you can find him. You can find me right where you found me at, right here. So there we go. And we'll be back. Not sure. Maybe next week after. We're back soon, though. And until then, keep climbing.
Happy holidays.